Welcome to the GWIKS Chosån Book Talk series. I'm so delighted to host this book talk series this semester. The field of Chosån Korea, both history and literature, is relatively a small field. So it is not common to see monographs or translations being published in English every year, but recently there were 5 books that were published in 2020 and 21, and I thought I must just absolutely prepare this book talk series to invite all the amazing authors. So as a scholar of Chosån Korea, I'm just so excited to be having this book talk series in March, April, and May. So those of you interested in learning about Chosån Korea, please attend all the 5 book talks. All right, so it is now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Si Nae Park, and I am so delighted to have her as our first guest speaker of this book talk series. Si Nae Park is an associate professor of East Asian languages and civilizations at Harvard University. She studies the literature, culture of text, history of writing and reading, and linguistic thought of Korea within the larger context of the Sinographic cosmopolis. Her research specializes in the role of linguistic sensibilities and perception, conceptualization, production, and diffusion of literature, literary historiography, and canon formation. Her first book, The Korean Vernacular Story, Telling Tales of Contemporary Chosån in Sinographic Writing, published by Columbia University Press in 2020, explores the rise of the vernacular story genre yadam in sinographic writing, challenging the script Hangul-focused approach to 20th century Korean language and literature. So today's her talk will be based on this book. So please join me in welcoming Professor Park.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Jisoo Kim, for your very kind introduction. And it's such a great pleasure and honor to have an opportunity to speak as part of the Institute's book talk series on Chosån Korea. It's a good time for Chosån studies. I'd like to thank Min-hye Kim, who's the program coordinator, for her guidance and assistance. And I'd like to thank the audience for attending. And I very much look forward to our conversation afterward. And now, the talk was advertised as having 2 components. First, the summary of the book, and next, the contextualization of the book's argument. And I decided to mix things up a little bit by beginning with the book's argument and the context around it before moving on to the highlights of each chapter, and by including a discussion of how the book evolved from a curiosity sparked into a finished book, with the hope that the book also sparks some new curiosity. So let me turn on share screen. Language native to a place, written or spoken expressions in the language of place. The language or dialect spoken by the ordinary people in a particular country or region. These definitions of the word vernacular call to mind that the meaning of vernacular intersects place and language. In studies of Korean literature, the word is intimately and quite convolutedly tied up with the Korean script. The Korean alphabet that was invented in the mid-15th century and called by its new name Hangul since the 1930s. In today's presentation, Vernacular Eloquence of Chosån Korea Beyond the Korean Script, which complements my recent book publication, my primary goal is to rethink a persistent misconception about Korean literature. And this misconception is shaped by the assumption that a particular troika is the sine qua non, an essential condition for the making of Korean literature in the vernacular: the Korean people, the Korean language, which is the agglutinative language that has the word order of subject, object, and verb, and the Korean script. So I do it by discussing the yadam genre. So yadam being a compound consisting of 2 sinographs, one ya, field, wilderness, or unofficial, as opposed to cho, court, official affairs, and tam, talk, to mean unofficially circulating stories. So I discussed the yadam genre of Chosån Korea as a prime example of a type of vernacular eloquence that developed with an eye toward being neither written in the Korean script nor being solely drawn from Korean speech, but nonetheless a medium that expresses the language of the local. In so doing, I seek to rehabilitate yadam as something more interesting and important, but at the same time, rehabilitate pre-modern Korean literature as cultural artifacts rooted in pre-modern Koreans' willing participation in a larger literary universe of the shared literary heritage of East Asia. And that shared literary heritage hinged upon the conceptualization of literacy with two fundamental elements: the prestige of literary Sinitic, also known as Literary Chinese, Hanmun in Korean, which was the highly compressed and elusive classical language of pre-20th century East Asia, and the vehicle for composing literature, mun, and also a medium of cosmopolitan attribute for being translocal and transtemporal, and sinographs, commonly called Chinese characters, as an East Asian script. That is to say, literary Sinitic and sinographs were more than just Chinese, and were certainly not an awkward foreign medium, but a basic tool for literature and inscriptional practices for those who lived in pre-20th century Korea. In this literary universe, which I refer to as the sinographic cosmopolis in my research, and which others have called the sinographic sphere, Chosån yadam arose within, through negotiation with and without nullifying the authority of literary Sinitic by hybridizing and diversifying. Nonetheless, it was a written medium expressing a mode of vernacular belonging. So I published my first monograph with Columbia University Press in August 2020, and the book focuses on a collection of anecdotal narratives called the kungmunhak, repeatedly recited stories of the East, compiled by No Myung-hum. The kungmunhak is home to stories told, heard, and retold by and for Joseon people of the time, and a cultural artifact rooted in an era when the present time, the here and now, was being discovered as a distinct and worthy matrix to be represented in literary expression. I contend that the entries in the kungmunhak collectively stage a narrative world undergirded by the 18th century Joseon elite's deep interest in painting the cultural landscape and zeitgeist of their story right then and there, and as a society in flux. And the compiler, No Myung-hum, did so with a great deal of curiosity, if not wonderment, and with little interest in passing judgment on the state of contemporary society vis-a-vis the ideals of antiquity, or about people's behavior as measured against Confucian virtues found in contemporaneous moral primers. And to construct this narrative world, the compiler wrote innovatively, rather than relying on the established medium of literature, literary Sinitic. The compiler chose to write more plainly so that the narrative world tell plot-driven tales while interweaving diverse lexicon and phraseology to enhance the written text's capacity to evoke the language and customs of Joseon. While the kungmunhak does not evoke yadam in its title, and the word yadam predates No's collection, the pattern of its reception attests that the kungmunhak was a consequential text. And that is to say, how yadam gained traction to represent a corpus of similarly styled anecdotal narratives developed concurrently with the duplication, emulation, and cannibalization of stories originating from the kungmunhak. I just realized I want to show you the images of what kungmunhak looks like. And here you will notice one of the images contains a vernacular rendition of what I claim to be a text that is already a vernacular medium. So I'll address that later. And my argument is twofold. So the part that I just covered answers what kind of text is the kungmunhak and what is the significance of it in the development of yadam. The second part of my argument is concerned with the question, how does viewing the kungmunhak as such change the way we think about, or we should think about, yadam and pre-modern Korean literature? So here goes a little bit of history of yadam studies as well as literary historiography. So yadam is often described as a particular defined genre. And one reason is because the word was used at several different historical moments to sometimes used to describe things, sometimes to be rhetorical, to refer to a wide variety of texts that arrive with some kind of claim with oral provenance. I argue that the difficulty, in fact, had much to do with the tendency of dehistoricization driven by a nation-centered linguistic literary narrative that began with how the genre of yadam was first introduced as an object of academic inquiry in the 1930s. It was an era of the formation of the classics of Korean literature, kungmunhak, under the discourse of a nation-centered historiography known as the late Chosån social transformation thesis or internal development thesis. And this view holds that the late Chosån society in flux was evidence of pre-modern Korea's indigenously driven progress toward modernity without the interference or influence of external forces such as the West and Japan. And it worked as a master narrative that drove academia at the time to trace commercialization, urbanization, and voices of social reform, and voices that attack Confucian orthodoxy, along with various literary texts or corpus of texts that's written in the Korean script. And it is within this kind of discursive context that the Chosån yadam were introduced as a kind of data set, data source for scholars and students from which to bolster the master narrative, which is late Chosån social transformation thesis. So it kind of creates this interesting loop. Within a nation-centered literary historiography, in Korean, it's called a kungmunhak, or history of national literature. Moreover, there existed a particular othering of literary synotic and sinographs to narrate the history of Korean literature in terms of the eventual victory of Korean literature after a long period of being dominated by Chinese canon and Chinese writing. And in this view, the particular importance of yadam was its overt claim of orality. Oral provenance and oral circulation are explicit in that yadam narratives typically conclude with expressions such as this, so they say, or it is said, un, or ui. Along with this, importantly, the fact that yadam narratives were written in a relatively easy to decipher medium, contrasted with typical Hanmun texts, was interpreted through a lens of what I will call romantic nationalism, which treats the spoken language of the ordinary folk and a nation as a unity. This ideological view led to an oversimplistic view that yadam were records of oral composition, stories delivered by professional storytellers in the urban marketplace as observers of society in transitioning to modernity in the first instance, after which the stories underwent some sort of editorial tinkering at the hands of some sympathetic elites who recorded or documented them later. The orality of yadam was taken as oral residue, allegedly having some kind of unmediated connection with how Korean masses spoke. By the 1990s, the internal development thesis had been widely criticized and was no longer the paradigm for understanding Korea's past. The supposition of oral storytelling or a professional storyteller as the original lifeblood of yadam too was revisited in the 1990s to give way to approaches that began viewing yadam as a form of literary composition. Nevertheless, there exists a continuity in scholarly discussion in that this shift did not stop yadam research from viewing the language of yadam as having still some kind of direct connection to the spoken Korean language, predicated on the assumption that after the 15th century introduction of the Korean script, Koreans would have preferred to use that over Chinese or sinographic writing to write literary forms associated with orality because it's associated with Korean language. Such a view neglects the agency of yadam writers or any writers. If a written form evokes orality, taking it to be a natural consequence of something originated from an oral context or oral source only is rather naive, because committing something delivered orally to the realm of the written is never unmediated or transcription-like, but involves a conceptual operation of what I will call literarization, meaning the act of putting something into a literary form. So this act entails a process of textualization that occasions stylistic choice on the part of the one who commits it to a literary form. And here style involves both individual style as well as a period style, and which then would happen negotiation as negotiation within a given inscriptional ecology or aesthetic standards and conventions. So foregrounding stylistic choice instead of oral residue, this project focused on the late 18th century as an era of heightened interest in the here and now, and that helps us historicize yadam more efficaciously and helps us uncover how sinographic writing based on the word order of literary synetic, that is subject, verb, object, unlike the subject, object, verb of Korean, could have served as a very productive site for the making of a new literary vernacular. So as such, the book puts forward several emendations to a number of interconnected, commonly accepted ideas about pre-modern Korean literature broadly and Chosŏn yadam specifically. For example, the alleged linguistic aspirations of the Korean people with the transition from Chinese to Korean as the principal written language for the Korean people, the linguistic aspiration to use the natural language of the Korean people was realized. Or yadam is written in classical or literary Chinese. Yadam are short narratives written in classical Chinese. There is, or the suggestion that an unmediated connection between the language of yadam and the Korean ethos. The colloquialisms and expressions found in yadam encapsulate the cultural sentiments of the Korean ethno-nation. And I think part of this is the kind of vocabulary that's used in Korea. And I think it seems more jarring when I think they're rendered in English. And also yadam was written in the wrong writing system. Yadam should have been written in the Korean script because it derived from oral storytelling. Or kungmunhak specifically is an incongruous text and a curious case of sort of a new wine in an old wineskin. The world that it wants to portray has been discovered, but the form has not. As I prepared this presentation, I realized that although the book is based upon my dissertation of fall 2020, its genesis actually goes further back in time to a weekly reading group that I attended as a graduate student. In this reading group, we read the Canadian missionary James Scarscale's English translations from a story collection called the kungmunhak, or Compendium of Records of Hearsay, to compare how Gale translated his yadam source texts into English. The reading extended across several months, and the more I read, the more I was struck by the nature of the story's linguistic medium. Reading Hanmun texts is supposed to be done with more frequent consultation of reference materials than you want, and always with the help of a more experienced reader. I mean, in our case, we have so many different types of reference materials, and the internet is always a great source, not so much back then. And our group did work with a modern Korean rendition, GWIKS, and with a particularly, also one of the members was a particularly expert reader, a Korean professor emeritus, who was an expert of Sinitic poetry, or Hanshi. Nevertheless, setting aside the grammar and allusions to prior texts, what struck me was words that made up the text, the lexical texture, such as 투숙, 내외, 상경, 본전, 여차, 분부, 영리, 다소, 안전, as in 어느 안전이라고, not safety. Just to say out loud for those of you who know the Korean language. And words like these resonated closely with the Korean language expressions that I grew up knowing, sometimes in everyday context and sometimes in more archaic styles of writing. What exactly is the nature of this baby Hanmun, as some of us called it? With this question in mind, I decided to write on yadam for my doctoral dissertation. And the completed dissertation was a work focused on linguistic concerns, arguing that yadam are better understood as anecdotal narratives written in a style that imitates oral forms in an era where Choson literati became interested in various activities dealing with expressions from the time and customs, 시속 칭위, and that was to revise the notion that yadam somehow reflected how people actually spoke, or the definition of yadam as records of orally circulating stories. In the book, I further historicize yadam by focusing on the kungmunhak more closely as a text that emerges from a very important and interesting era that has begun to discover the present generation, recent times, as something to be written about, patterned after, and something to be made more legible. So in chapter 1, the compiler, or marginalized Yangban at the center of the Chosŏn cultural scene, I give a kind of thick description of what Chosŏn society at the time was, and places the compiler No Myung-hum in it to map out the collection's orientation. Seoul in the 18th century was a sprawling metropolis, home to the most privileged among the Chosŏn Yangban elites, and the capital of contemporary culture. It was a place where people expected to witness the largest volumes of the most exotic things, to be exposed to the newest knowledge, and to observe dynamic sociocultural gatherings. Hwang Yun-seok, for example, based in Jeolla province, lamented that he was a provincial intellectual and compared living in Seoul to being on a shortcut in acquiring new knowledge. For an exiled official Chung Ya-kyung in the early 19th century, the worst that could ever happen to his two sons was lose touch with the goings-on in Seoul, as he's compared to being rendered, and he compares it to being rendered uncivilized and irrelevant using the Chunghwa, the language of Chunghwa, central efflorescence. Born and raised in Seoul, Park Jae-ga was a non-Yangban elite because of his status as the Seoul, a secondary son. He sang praises for being a Seoulite, calling it a place where governance and education arise, where people gather from all four corners, and where crowds of officials and illustrious notables, pavilions and towers and ships and carts, and an abundance of money and goods gather. So this Seoul-centered politics of space had an implication for how time was to be perceived and imagined in association with it. Since the Ming-Qing transition of 1644, Seoul, as the royal capital, had been home to monuments that shored up the orthodox thinking of Ming loyalism, namely Chosun as the legitimate heir of the civilization after the fall of the Ming in the hands of the Manchu Qing eventually in 1644. Such as the Samjeondo stele, which was erected as Chosun admitted defeat to the Qing, and the altar of great recompense, Taebodan, which was dedicated to three Ming emperors, including the first and the last one who committed suicide, apologized for the typo, and one who came to Joseon to give military to support during the Imjin invasion. By the 18th century, however, Seoul had also become a conduit for experiencing a world greater than Joseon through the Yeonhaeng, vicariously by reading about Yeonhaeng records, which are embassies to Beijing, where which were the Chosŏn court's diplomatic missions to the Qing. And many Chosŏn literati participated in it. Also, it was a huge entourage each visit, which involved not just the elites, but people from all walks of life. And it was a major site of commerce as well that connected Joseon's market to Beijing through importation of things and books, and Beijing being the capital of contemporary Qing China, and also itself a center of culture within China, but also was connected to other parts of the world, namely in Europe and other parts of the world. And especially books emerging from late imperial publishing boom, in late imperial Chinese publishing boom, were the Joseon elite's most desired commodities. And some participants of Yeonhaeng formed personal ties with contemporary Qing literati, and they eagerly share their experience with their peers back home, inspiring others to imagine the same or do the same. Furthermore, Seoul witnessed an unprecedented volume of cross-status sociocultural activities involving yadam, yangban and non-yangban, such as the formation of various poetry societies, or these yangban and non-yangban writing one another in order to endorse or give literary endorsements of one another's writings. And this was a phenomenon that some provincial scholars found quite unfathomable. For example, Hwang Yun-seok that I mentioned earlier, he did not want such co-mingling with non-Yangban people, despite the fact that he quite desired to be there or to have access to what was going on, especially in terms of books, Western science. And within this context arose new interests and a deep interest in charting the cultural achievements of the present times, as opposed to ko, and this idea of contemporaneity or my contemporaries, the present generation. And I turn, chapter 1 draws a lot from existing scholarship, although I really try to bring in both the Yeonhaeng aspect as well as what was already happening in Chosŏn in order to explain this idea and just how pervasive it really became. And I term these two ideas a sociability of contemporaneity. And it's a sense of belonging or the view of seeing oneself and another belonging to the same temporal category, despite status distinction and geographic boundaries within and beyond Chosŏn. And of course, that is not to say that people participating in these types of cross-status activities did not recognize one another's difference in terms of social backgrounds. But what I'm trying to suggest is that there was willingness to mingle with them as far as certain interesting ideas were concerned, as far as circulation of certain texts were concerned. So there was great tolerance in a way that such things hadn't been existed previously, as well as such things are quite considered unfathomable by scholars who weren't quite part of this kind of activities. And it is such a society that I sort of place our compiler, No Myung-hum. So he moved from Cheongju, Chungcheong province, where he was born and raised, and he moved to Seoul. And in Seoul, he became employed by one of the most illustrious and politically prominent families of the time, the family of Hong Bong-han. And if you're familiar with memoirs of Lady Haegyong and the film The Throne, Hong Bong-han is Lady Haegyong's father, Prince Sado's father-in-law, King Yeongjo's prime minister and in-law, and King Jeongjo's maternal grandfather. So No found employment in the household of the Hong family quite fortuitously, and probably he did not know that his ties with the Hong family would last for that long. He ended up spending, it seems, the latter half of his life, but there residing in one of the most coveted neighborhoods in all of Seoul, Angukbang, a place nestled between royal palaces and near the most dynamic commercial district called Unjong Street, present-day Chongno. No also gained a point of entry into the dynamic cultural scene of contemporary Joseon culture. He read, he copied, he took copious notes from books available there. He intermingled with some of the most prominent cultural figures. And in the book, I give more of a character portrayal that he's not this sort of suave person who enjoys being surrounded by famous people. Rather, he was a very reticent person and self-effacing individual. And yet you can place him in these interesting contexts. And it is thanks to his personal ties with the Hong family, which he didn't necessarily anticipate. And also the fact that this relationship was a rather nice one where the Hong family members treated him as their literary companion. So I end this chapter by pointing to the collection's autobiographical dimension, and No Myung-hum as once a provincial scholar, now a literary raconteur in Seoul. So by literary raconteur, I mean a writer of stories, as well as somebody who enjoyed telling stories, but with literary erudition, which was how he became employed by the Hong family in the first place. And here is a quote. I remember once following Master No to Pyum Pavilion in Yangcho's veranda in a crummy back alley of Cheongwon in Anbuk. Inebriated under the flickering lamplight, after a drinking spree, he was engaged in pleasant conversation without ever ceasing. As a young boy at the time, I was sitting in a corner, engrossed in listening to them. As unaware of the moon's setting and the cockcrow and the descending Big Dipper. It has been 50 years, yet the master's voice, face, words, and laughter are so present that it is as if he were still alive. In chapter 2, following chapter 1, which offers a bird's eye view of the cultural scene in the 18th century, this chapter discusses the Tongpen Aksong as a text that bears the stamp of a time closer to the world No lived and purports to be an assemblage of stories replete with insights into the inner workings of society in flux. So I try to do this by looking at 3 different things. One is that Seoul actually features quite prominently in the collection in a number of ways. Seoul is the most prominent place in all of the regions of Seoul within the narrative world. So taking the collection as a narrative stage. Many stories have Seoul as the primary backdrop. They have protagonists who are current, former, aspiring dwellers of Seoul, or are germane to famous Soulites in history, or people who were direct ancestors of powerful central elites of mid through late 18th century Chosån Korea. So the stories that are collected, that are present in the Tongpen Aksong seem to be stories that would have been very relevant to the people who lived there. So the Tongpen Aksong can thus be read in tandem with local histories of Seoul, such as a concise description of Seoul, Hangyong Chiryak, and a reference to the geography and of the Eastern Kingdom, Dongguk Yeoji Pigo, as well as the genealogy roster of top-ranking officials called Genealogical Records of Officials, Jinshinbo. So here indicates some of the places that I was actually able to trace and mark using this one traditional map called Susanjeondo. It's actually Susanjeondo. Importantly, not only is Seoul a storied place, so that is not to that is to sort of take a step back and look at the collection in terms of data. But within the narrative world, Seoul is also a concept. It's a myth, it's a fantasy, and that make up the psyche of characters that populate the collection's narratives, as well as how they view themselves vis-a-vis Seoul as this cultural capital of cultural center really determines how they make important decisions in their lives. And the second thing that I look at is that there is proximity between the temporal scope of the narrative world staged in the collection and that of the 18th century Chosŏn that the compiler lived in terms of both subject matters and how the stories treat certain subject matters pertaining to earlier periods. So I won't go into all of the details, but one thing that I deal with is the dealing with King Danjong, the death of King Danjong, which was one of the really early Chosŏn sort of tragedy that involves usurpation of King Sejo, which then led to the killing of a young boy king, and then persecuting and purging literati. And the Tongpen Aksong has several stories that are related to King Danjong or people who are related to them. And historical records suggest that 18th century was a particularly important period that really revisited that era and tried to exonerate individuals and try to commemorate them publicly and tracking down descendants of these purged literati. And one thing that I will point out here is that there are a lot of stories that deal with the 2 foreign invasions of the Imjin War and the Pyeongja War of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And these are the sort of the key events in as far as sort of historiography goes, the demarking point from mid-Joseon to late Joseon, and sort of, and the arrival of Ming loyalism and orthodox thinking and whatnot. In the stories in the Tongpaenakseong that deal with these two wars, or individuals who are going through the war situations, or families that survived, they are distinguishable from those narratives that appeared immediately after the wars, that are biographies and fictionalized biographies about our heroes, deserters, and about the separation and reunion of families, war captives, and uprooted individuals, and devastated places, mourning and commemoration of the deceased. In those war stories, the wounds are there. They're still open. The pain is there. In the war stories of the Tongpaenakseong, the pain of the wars is more akin to vestiges of wounds that have already closed up, a trigger for neither raw grief nor relief. And they rather reflect a society that has moved on and now looks back at the past through the lens of social memory. And finally, focusing on the recurring theme of fluctuating fortunes and social order, I explained that the narrative world of the Tongpaenakseong signals a society in flux in a way that members aspire to ascend in status, or they are fearful that they might lose their present standing. So 빈부 귀천 or 부귀 빈천 here, well-to-do, distinguished or highborn, poor or lowly. These are the concerns that really occupy the minds of the people in the world of the Tongpaenakseong. Those on the lower rungs of the social ladder could imagine achieving better lives if they were willing to make extra efforts and were shrewd enough. The social use of virtue, which is really interesting, that whereby individuals display Confucian virtue for others to witness, and therefore gain, and thereby gain some kind of social capital, and move other people to do things in their favor. And these kind of things play a key role in the way status was achieved as well as maintained. Those at the top at the same time could claim residual merit, yeogyong, of their ancestors' good deeds as source of their illustrious social standing in present times, but they too are predisposed to accept that one's social standing and one's family's social standing can be transitory and alterable. The narrative world does not promote a rat race, but is interested in portraying how people's lives, irrespective of their social status, inherited or achieved, are interconnected in complex and mutually influential and dependent ways. The narratives are difficult to summarize and instead seem to reflect a will to illustrate how new social ties are formed, how social intelligence is used and developed, and what action causes what kind of consequences, not only at an individual level, but on a social level. The third chapter is where I discuss the language. So it's the most pertinent chapter to today's talk, entitled The Language, Articulating in the Language of the Here and Now. And chapter 3 makes 2 points that supplement my dissertation's conclusions. First, that the language of the Tongpaenakseong is best seen as No Myung-hum's stylistic choice to articulate stories of contemporary Chosŏn society in a medium that will tell such stories in a more efficacious way. That is, the Tongpaenakseong uses a wide repertoire of words to weave a written medium that is far plainer than ordinary literary synthetic composition, and a medium that results in a medium that evokes and represents, and that is mimetic of the sociolinguistic realities of Chosŏn society. And second, the collection's claim of orality is not entirely descriptive, but has an element of conceit. As such, I complicate the view by arguing that the existing characterization of yadam as record of orally circulating stories is inadequate And instead, I suggest that some of the stories seem to be old stories told new, rewritten, and some of the stories can be read as new stories that are actually presented as if that had been already circulating. So there is this will to impose this aura of contemporaneity of all of the stories, irrespective of their place of origin. And this chapter begins with a discussion of late Chosŏn linguistic and inscriptional ecology. And it is my attempt to give a comprehensive overview of literary activities and different types of literary and inscriptional activities. So here I'm distinguishing writing in general. So for example, if we're discussing someone keeping record using some kind of writing system, or keeping a government document using idu, I'm using the term inscriptional practices for inscription. Whereas if it's a production of a text that was created with an intention to make it be accepted as a kind of literature, form of literature, then I'm using literary. Or if a piece of writing conforms to existing literary conventions. So here I emphasize terms such as digraphia or diglossia, two languages or two scripts that form hierarchical relationship in literary practices. And using these two terms only is rather inadequate to think about late Chosŏn, and it probably is applied to the rest of the pre-20th century. While the prestige of writing in literary Semitic remained unchallenged, there were different types of interplays between literary Semitic and the spoken and written vernacular Korean. Interplays between literary Semitic and Chinese vernacular Semitic, which is commonly called Baihua, or the language of Chinese, late imperial Chinese fiction. And interplays between Chinese vernacular Semitic and Korean writing written exclusively in the Korean script, especially of adaptations and translations of Chinese vernacular fiction into Korean. And then there is interplays between literary Semitic and the Korean colloquialisms. Now, so this is very complex. And I tried my best to sort of illustrate that as much as possible. And to give just one example of and to make it a bit more concrete, scholars at the time were interested in rendering vernacular poetry, for example, kasa or shijo, into Semitic poetry. So they did this genre translation. Or scholars were interested in collecting Korean sayings in a number of different ways, sometimes straightforward literary Semitic rendition, sometimes mixing two different strategies of translation, as well as utilizing sinographs to take just the meaning or just the sound. One phenomenon that really deserves our attention that formed this inscriptional ecology is the spread of Chinese vernacular fictional narratives, which not only gave Chosŏn readers new kind of stories, as they are new books, but they also gave Chosŏn readers an opportunity to taste a new kind of literary medium, one that utilizes what has been called the simulated context of using the voice of a professional storyteller who is sort of delivering an actual performance in front of a live audience. This conceit is embedded within the form. And also the language of Chinese vernacular fictional narratives, which I call Chinese vernacular Semitic, significantly draws upon expressions from Chinese colloquialisms to achieve linguistic verisimilitude, meaning by making the written embrace expressions in social contexts. The main point is that No Myung-hum was writing in an environment where Chosŏn literati were very much interested in encoding or decoding and sort of processing what they called 시속 칭의, idioms that reflect contemporary times and customs. So there is this concern to record and integrate what's being said, as well as how people are recognizing as expressions that emerged from, say, the Chosŏn period or present times, which is in and of itself is a very subjective category. So put it simply, although I call No Myung-hum as someone who wrote innovatively, he was writing in an environment that was ripe for words that had been previously deemed unsuitable or too lowly or irrelevant to be encoded sinographically, sometimes via translation, sometimes via using sinographs as phonographs, or sometimes using this method of reading sinographs interpretively, like Japanese kundoku style, or adopting terms that become more recognized within Chosŏn context, despite the fact that they were derived from Chinese vernacular phonetic from different types of texts, including Chinese vernacular fiction. So I will not introduce all the aspects of the language thing, but there was a question about rendering Korean sayings in sinographs or sinographic writing. So here is an example using the phrase that I introduced before to suggest, the center, Seoul as the center of contemporary culture, falls to the countryside and children to Seoul. And this is how 이익 rendered it, right? 우마지자의 하향, 인지자의 상경. And here you see parallel sort of structure that he imposes and make contrasting two things. And he elsewhere where he collected a bunch of vernacular Korean sayings, he uses this kind of format to suggest 도간에 든 쥐 갈 데 없다, or mouse stuck in a jar has no place to run away. 이봉지서 묻혀 가주. So what you see here is he's using the form of what's called a kind of ancient poem, poetic form, which is harkens back to the 시경, the book of poetry. So here you see him translating vernacular saying into a phonetic form, and this is what I mean by a conceptual operation that is happening here, committing something that's orally circulating, but putting it into a literary form. And in the narrative world, characters, especially those who are in a situation where they have to mark their lower social standing or the higher social standing of the interlocutor, characters they use indicate their social positions using form of address. But the form of address that's used in the narrative world is this, 상전님 or 상전주, 형님, 나으리님, 아기씨. So you don't see a direct one-on-one correspondence between how things are pronounced based upon how one would ordinarily read any kind of sinographs. And there's also what's happening is mixing of interpretive reading, 주 especially, to indicate 님, the honorific. And the 동편학송 also contains expressions commonly used in Idu documentary writing, such as 의형, 의신, 의자, here to mean I, myself, this very person, or my older brother, my son. And this kind of expression also appears in a situation where the speaker is in a court case kind of situation, or making a request in a formal setting, talking to a magistrate, or claiming to be, say, a commoner filing a petition. So what I'm trying to suggest is that this type of thing is also used when in such expressions in real life would call for this type of writing. In the 동편학송, there's not that many, but still there are these interesting rhetorical questions that are being asked by some kind of narrator, which is not No Myung-hum, basically. A young boy and a girl that are spending time in each other's companion into the night, how could there not be a sharing of joy? He was strict by nature under his orders. Who among his slaves and servants would dare to tarry in carrying out his orders? So here, the offset here is something quite interesting. So the written text, so this is a line-by-line comparison of one story from the Tongpanakson written in vernacular Semitic and vernacular rendition. And it's color-coded. So blue indicates straightforward correspondence, one-on-one direct correspondence, and that is adoption of the word in the source text and giving it only the phonetic decoding or encoding. And red indicates some kind of translation. And green is some variation, but still exhibiting strong affinity with at least one word based upon the original expression. So this slide, in fact, illustrates an important aspect of the nature of the Tongpanakson, or the nature of yadam, as a type of vernacular eloquence. It is a vernacular medium seen from the standpoint of how it departs from literary Semitic, and while it is also while it is at a remove from literary Semitic, it is also at a remove from what Chosŏn people considered ordinarily Korean. However, it is crucially important to note here that while translation is needed, the process of translation is highly straightforward, one that relies on one's knowledge of the meaning of sinographs rather than allusions to the classics. So in many ways, when you read yadam text, you sometimes need annotations, but often that's because it relates to some kinds of social institution or historical events or historical individuals, rather than because of the fact that they are allusions to the classics or literary canon and histories. So the fourth chapter, the text in motion, the circulation of the Tongpanakson and the rise of yadam in the Chosŏn manuscript context, this offers a detailed description of how the Tongpanakson was spread and made durable, discussing how the publication, circulation, and reception of the Tongpanakson and how that relates to the yadam, the rise of yadam as a genre. And here I come back to the compiler social ties with the Hong family and trace how No Myung-heung's son, No Keung, sought after and received literary endorsement from members of the Hong family, and by soliciting them to write framing materials to his father's collection, prefaces, and postfaces. And along came a biography. And several points that I want to stress here is that after No's passing, that No Myung-heung's son went around and did this, and these can be seen as a process of publishing a text, putting a text or releasing a text into a more of a public domain, reaching out of a private possession to be read by outside reader, even if we don't suppose some anonymous reader in a publishing market, for example. And members of the Hong family emphasize that the Tongpanakson was an unparalleled work of Pae surpassing all other Pae, for example, for its capacity to supplement history and for its literary merit. So the Tongpanakson was introduced to the world, but also it bore a very interesting and tantalizing invitation to emendation for future readers, something hinted at in one of the prefaces. And at the same time, it was a text that was not tied to a bygone period, a closed up era, but it was a text that claims to be pertinent to a society of one's own living, which again can be a very subjectively defined. So such rhetorical framing primed readers of the Tongpanakson to treat the collection as both reading materials and a raw source for emendation and rewriting. And this eventually led reading the Tongpanakson to the formation of the rise of new kind of texts, which then can be formed and recognized at the time as well as now as some kind of a corpus of texts that belong to the same kind of historical family. So after all that really a lot of details, here I am about to deliver the closing remarks. So here, let us get back to vernacular, a word that conjures up the idea of the language of the local, or place and language conjoined. 동penak송 is a text that calls attention to its own vernacularity, most overtly in its title and most subtly in its style. At least it can be almost unrecognized because of its sinographic medium. At the same time, it is a vernacular text whose association with place and language invites further reflections owing to the element of time's place that plays a certain role in the way vernacularity of the 동penak송 is imagined and executed. So here I give this interpretation of the meaning of the 동penak송 in the following way by breaking it down in this manner. Regarding the 동, the word is a term to contrast what the historian Remco Brucker has called the supra-dynastic qualities of the Korean peninsula and its people. So to treat that as a distinctive category as opposed to China, and here I would add Sinitic antiquity as a point of reference, orientation, and distinction. And in literature, the use of 동 in titles of works existed throughout the Joseon period, but often as a way to not only consciously emulate a canonical text within the shared literary tradition, but also assert parity in cultural achievement for the local, with a prime example being the early Joseon literary anthology 동문선, the One Xuan of the East. The 동 in the 동penak송 certainly indicates Joseon, but it does not in fact carry any supradynastic quality, nor does it reflect an interest in calibrating what originates in Joseon with a past paragon. The 동 here is temporarily much more specific, indexing a more narrowly defined time span with an eye toward charting Joseon society in recent times. And pai too is a term with a long history. It originates as a word to refer to stories that circulated orally among the common folk and were collected by state officials to use them for good governance, with its origins going all the way back to the Han Dynasty. Clearly, No Myung-hoon was hardly the first to use it to present an assemblage of anecdotal narratives. But unlike the predecessors like 여공 패설 by Lee Jae-hyun or late Korea antecedent, or the storyteller's miscellany, in both cases, the term pai was invoked to write about the lives of interests of literati as sort of in a self-effacing gesture. And also, they were written in classical medium, literary Sinitic. The pai in the 동penak송 is more comprehensive in its scope because it doesn't represent a particular subset of society, but inclusive of and embracing society at large, portraying the experiences and preoccupations and motivations, both the high and the low, along with the anxiety and aspirations of those in between. More, it is not inscribed in a medium that can be readily recognizable as classical. And lastly, nak송 is an allusion to the zhuangzi. Its literal meaning is repeated recitation. It appears in the compound, the grandson of repeated recitation, in a conversation between two individuals as they discuss essential practices in attaining a way to achieve understanding of the way, Tao. And one asks the other how she knows about such practices. And when asked, this new you starts by providing a list of steps in anthropomorphic terms. And Losong, or Naksong, the grandson of repeated recitation, refers to the act of oral recitation, but it is presented as the teacher of the son of aided by ink, metaphor for the written. So Naksong alludes to something that promises valuable insights, but has yet to be committed to writing or preceded by an authoritative prior text. So by annotating the 동penak송 as such, I want to stress that what constitutes the language of the local or the place language intersection includes simultaneously an anchoring and origin in Chosŏn, and at the same time, things that do not originate from Chosŏn or from local only. This distinction explains why the lexical texture of the Tongpenaksong exhibits heterogeneity in terms of origin. Korean colloquialisms, Korean sayings, words associated with Idu, writing, Chinese colloquialisms, and traits of storyteller, which is originating from late imperial Chinese vernacular fiction. So a typical book on the history of Korean literature classifies pre-modern Korean literature into 3 categories: Hanmun literature, literature written in Korean, oral literature, or performative tradition. But yadam resists comfortable inclusion in such a categorization with its sinographic veneer that nonetheless differs from orthodox literary Sinitic writing by consciously deploying elements that originate not from the Korean language alone, but also, but from rather linguistic practices or inscriptional practices at that time. I'm going to close up now. So my final point is that based upon all this, existing scholarship and I myself have used the term variant literary Sinitic or variant Hanmun, but it doesn't quite capture how impactful it was, because what happened in Tongpenaksong was not a fleeting thing. So instead, I propose Korean Vernacular Sinitic. And also one final point is that by stressing the need to decouple vernacular eloquence from either the Korean script or Korean speech, my intention is not to deny the well-documented increase in the use of the Korean script and the remarkably diverse and rich textual practices and culture that centered around the vernacular script. Rather, my point is to recognize sinographic writing as a productive site for the emergence of literary vernacular in pre-20th century. Thank you very much. Apologize for going over time, and I'm ready to take any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Wow, thank you so much. That was just so fascinating, and I learned so much. I mean, that was really a comprehensive overview of yadam, starting from historiography of literary scholarship on yadam and discussions about No Myung-hoon, the literary landscape of Seoul, and getting into details of the language, vernacular language. Thank you so much. Actually, I had prepared my own questions, but I'm not going to ask that. I'm going to reserve, because we received so many interesting questions from our audience. So I would like to address them, as many as possible. So I'll just begin with with questions from our audience. Okay, so we'll start with Carolina Pedreros. She's asking, what were the most relevant themes in yadam, and how did they reflect the Korean nationalist spirit? Does yadam integrate any image of Korean women, or were there even writers of this trend in that period?
Thank you for your question, Carolina. And some of the most prominent themes at least in the book, I try to highlight this sort of status awareness. Are you of highborn? Am I highborn? Or can I become better than rise above my social standing? So many of the stories also may be read as sort of Cinderella type of rags to riches stories for both men and women. But also what scholars have also highlighted is this Seoul as an urban space, and people go there to spend money and drink away things. That's also one of the things. But if I'm narrowing down in terms of Tongpenaksong, such are the things that are most recognizable, but as sort of new. But it also deals with a lot of incident, I guess, and episodes that deal with just everyday concerns and anecdotes about a famous historical person. And you can really it's hard to summarize because by 19th century, what happened is the volume really grew. So in the Dongpaenakseong, I discussed sort of 78 stories, 19th century story collections, hundreds of them. And they really tried to be as comprehensive as possible by expanding the scope of what would be considered. But still, a lot of the yadam collections, they don't necessarily go sort of prior to the early period. Sort of the really early period, the early Chosŏn period. There are war stories. A lot of stories deal with women. Many women are shrewd women. They're very smart. They're very resourceful. There are also stories about women in chastity, suicidal women after the death of their husbands. But many of the stories in the end end up with people sort of affirming the value of life rather than sort of ideological evaluation of individuals' action. So I hope that answers the question. But in terms of writers, it's quite difficult to say that because a lot of the narratives circulated anonymously, and also in general, Korean sort of literary sphere, it's hard to establish a professional writer. I think that really as a concept, somebody who's writing for this anonymous writer to earn money, that's a concept that you see with the arrival of people like Lee In-jik, and even Lee Kwang-soo didn't make a lot of money. So the environment was quite different from what one would generally anticipate as, you know, writing to seek fame didn't quite exist. So it's kind of a difficult question to answer.
Okay, thank you. So next question is by Thomas Slesiak. What was the role of the Hyangni low-level clerks that did not strictly fit any specific social stratum in development of semi-formal means of communication or storytelling narratives? I'm asking because I know very well their involvement in preparation of Idu and Kugyeol scripts, and I'm curious about their contributions, if any, to yadam or other similar styles.
Thank you very much for your question. That's a very interesting question. And there has been suggestions of non-Yangban, namely perhaps Seoul or Hyangmi or Seori, involving in producing these kind of texts. What I can speak from my research with limited, which is based upon bunch of texts, anonymously circulating, anonymously written mostly, is that what's achieved in this vernacular eloquence that I call this literary medium is that without the classical training, you can read it, you can write it. And if you go to the mid-19th century, there is a really huge collection of biographies, which also reads very much like yadam stories, called Ihang Kungmunhak, and it is about these sort of secondary status people who are otherwise very erudite in their own areas, and they're specialists. They have literacy, but not geared toward this academic training to be an expert of the Confucian classics and to be a statesman. And that kind of language, narratives of such texts and yadam have certain correspondence, although then if you are dealing with those texts, there is also a tendency to write more polished in a polished way. So you also see adoption of classical allusions and whatnot. But a lot of texts circulated anonymously, but what I can tell is the register or the level of language, the vernacularity that's achieved in yadam texts is certainly a text that could have been very much embraced by or created by people without classical training.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is by Anastasia Pogateva. Yadam develops Chosŏn literature. I wonder how much the language in yadam changed compared to Chosŏn in terms of narrative elements.
I'll just mention one thing. In 19th century, you see yadam collections emergence of kind of voluminous yadam collections. At the same time, there is great interest in sort of collect any kind of short either anecdotal or fictional, but mostly anecdotal, that in the name of supplementing history. And Paesol, there was sort of 대동 패림 or 패림 kind of text. So this forest of Pae kind of text also emerged, and there the scope, I believe, is wider, and the Pae itself is a category that is also very elusive because it's often introduced as what's left, what an umbrella term for that doesn't quite fit into existing categories of literature, which often included anecdotal narratives or little snippets about simple facts or interesting things. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. So next question by Elena Kondratyeva. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but I'm in the process of translating Yadam stories from modern Korean into Russian. I wonder if there are any linguistic and stylistic features unique for Yadam stories. I think you've covered a lot in your talk, but if you could just, briefly maybe mention one or two things about this.
So I think if we 고소설 큰 사전 type of thing, I'm talking about the one that's published by Professor Park Jae-yeon, who's an expert of translated Chinese novels as well as vernacular novels, and those dictionaries would come in handy. What I also found quite handy is this online dictionary created by Yeongnam Hakwe, and that's lexical items culled from documents, so 고문서. So that's also a category where you can see sort of snippets of non sort of classical type of medium and expressions of 시속 칭위 type of expressions, and there I found a lot of useful correspondence in the kind of words that are used in Yadam texts, and so that's also something useful.
Right. Thanks. So our next question by Shinong Hong. So the question is asking about the difference between yasa and yadam. Mm-hmm. So do you think are the literary and historiographical values of these two?
Mm-hmm. So there is overlapping. So there are parts that converge, and in fact, one of the variant ibon of 동패낙송 calls itself 동국 폐사, so unofficial history of the Eastern Kingdom. So as the stories travel, it's really up to who makes use of them. And also when the 동패낙송 tale stories were introduced, they were introduced as 폐, and 폐 as a category itself was often used to mean something that did get left out by 조, official history. So someone would say, I record this as a way to supplement what didn't make into the official history. So depending on what the story is, for example, if it is about, say, 송시열, then if a reader sees value in it and also it amends a little bit, tweaks things here and there, adds more things, and then in the process of reception, then a yadam can certainly turn into yasa, and vice versa. So I think that's it's sort of in the eyes of the reader, and such things actually did happen in the process of reading.
So next we have a question from Suyong-san. So she has two questions. So first question is, how is the compiler's mediating agency represented in the selection of the stories? It seems that No's autobiographical impulse is at odds with his desire for representing contemporaneity, which is of course specific to the 18th century and Seoul. And second question is, it was similar to the question that I had. How do you situate 동패낙송 in the development of yadam genre? The major characteristics of the language and content of 동패낙송 are all present in the following yadam collections.
Thank you. Yes, the second question is also something that it just became very clear to me that so I'll just answer the second question first. What became clear to me is that in a way, I'm also adopting the tendencies of existing scholarship where, because I'm building my idea also upon the fact that you see a lot of texts moving into 19th century texts, or a lot of Dongpaenhaksung stories appearing and being adopted in the 19th century texts. And my main point was to suggest that even earlier than that, text-to-text transmission was possible. It's just done in a different way. And also the reception of Dongpaenhaksung indicates something quite interesting, where this sort of syntagmatic lifting of actual wording becoming part of creating new text. So, so that part, certainly, and the formation of each individual story later coming collection that adopts Dongpaenhaksung, of course, those compilers are themselves writers, readers, and curators of the text that they are creating. And yet, what I wanted to suggest is that they did so by using the kind of strategy, linguistic strategy or characteristic, the texture that No Myung-hun creates, which you really don't see in sort of earlier types of texts of such nature, anecdotal narratives. And the fact that they are literally lifting it and create new texts, there is an acknowledgement of viewing that as a kind of literary category or literary thing that is to be appropriated, especially given the fact that we're discussing a literary tradition where the use of a prior text actually is in itself a sort of canonizing kind of act. And that actually relates to a prior question about yasa and yadam. When later coming writers or compilers, they cull materials, harvest it, and use them for their own purposes, you see different kind of stories emerging, and even at the level of characterization. So one thing that really becomes clear is that the didactic voice actually emerges, and 19th century yadam texts are sort of filled with heavily didactic, or for example, people who do bad things, they always end up getting punished or something like that. Conniving people get punished, whereas in the Dongpaenhaksung, you see sort of homicidal person but gets away. It's more about their intention and how they survive their world. And that kind of which I characterize as wonderment or sort of curiosity, that really dies out. And 19th century become more, one might say, sort of, conservative even. But at the same time, use of didacticism itself is a way to make certain things legible to people in society at large. So you do see different strategies. And one text from the mid-19th century, which actually used the word ya, but it draws heavily from Chinese classical tales. And the language becomes very convoluted because it uses classical tales as well as Chinese vernacular phonetic and telling a Korean story. And some of them are adaptations, some of them are new stories, but sort of, rewritten texts. So it does become very, but one thing that I wanted to emphasize is that the interest in what's happening right now, and to use a particular type of register to express that seem to be lifted and used, and then they're become catalysts for doing something new, expressing something new. Sometimes it's pulled in one direction to make it even more vernacular. Sometimes it's pulled into another direction to become more classical. The first one, so autobiographical impulse. So my suggestion is that one important thing that I try to tease out was the fact that he was a very irrelevant individual in a society that had been, that was sort of marginalizing elites. And he himself come from a very humble background, poor scholar who had to basically sell his literary skills to make ends meet. But the fact that he ended up being in the center of this place would have given him a lot of sort of ambivalence, that the fact that he had to serve these, his peers, but at the same time he experienced all these other things. So the autobiographical dimension that I try to bring out is the fact that he became more of someone who could claim goings on in Seoul is of his domain, something that he is relevant. He's not somebody who's distant and being anxious or wanting to be part of it, but rather he is an observer and is taking it in and sort of bring that in. So it's kind of reinventing himself as a relevant person, as a storyteller belonging to this new adaptive sociocultural context.
Well, thank you. I think I just must, ask this question because it's so relevant to the question that I had.
Thank you.
So I was, I was interested in asking you about this multitextuality in vernacular stories. And so, for example, like, scholars like Jisoo, like she, eloquently discusses about hybridity and layering of the culture in this, especially Onmun novels. And she has, written extensively based on Namonggosa version of Chunhyangjan. And there, in Chunhyangjan, there's such that mixed culture where you see this Chinese background and the elite background and the lower status people's culture, and all in hybrid format. So it's not just elites referencing to Hanmun text, but also Bangja, who is a servant, is using that text to engage in conversation with Master Yi and so forth. Whereas when he's talking to Chunyangi, like he uses this Virgo language. So so I was just wondering, this kind of multitextuality, I think this is so obvious in the later Onmun novels. But I'm just wondering, in the Dongpyenak Song, or in the earlier versions of the yadam, do you see this kind of this kind of multitextuality prevalent in all these texts?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And so I think the time that Noh Myung-hun wrote is an interesting period, because right after him we have Iok, Park Ji-won, and other people and other texts. So especially early 19th century and then mid 19th century, a lot of the work, kind of repertoires produced by the writers were deemed sort of iconoclastic. They what they are celebrated for, you see traits of that in the Dongpyenak Song. So one thing that I wanted to that I emphasize is that yes, he seems to have written something that, or created something that was very innovative. But it's so you see, you can call it sort of a precursor or like a prototype, but that's also looking at it from a modern, later period to kind of assess that. So what I try to do is what would have been available for him and what would have been something new for him, given that context. So that's what I wanted to bring out. So you certainly see in Dongpyenak Song what you just described as you can sort of, I guess if I flip it around, then I can say what I see in Dongpyenak Song is on what you just described is what I see in Dongpyenak Song on steroids, if I can sort of call that.
Thank you. So next question is by Hee-jung-sun. The question is, if the literary writing styles of yadams were related to the styles used by other intellectuals who were liberal in their eyes, such as Park Ji-won, and whether or not the yadam writings were also subject to and influenced by Cheongjo's stylistic restoration at all.
Yes, I think part of what we just described relates to this question. And I had a chance to read Park Ji-won's Yangbanjan. What was really interesting is that he also embraces or kind of interlaces existing or kind of orality or linguistic situation in a different way. So there is this concern to embrace that and make that present within and express that using words and style. For example, the court case scene, right? It has the Idu elements, and also when the people are presenting their cases, it's written in such a way that there is a kind of rhythm. It's 4-4-4-4. That as you read, you almost get a sense that it's sort of a perhaps gesture toward like a pansori or some kind of oral storytelling kind of scene, that's kind of humorous depiction of a scene. So you do, if you look at Eok's writing, he writes poems using 시속칭위 type of elements, and also he was interested in this encoding, basically 사투리 expressions. They have different names for the things that I know, but here are the many ways in which but there is this interest to record it. And so in the book, I mentioned that, yes, Mingqing transition and owning the Sinitic tradition heritage, or being more of an involved and legitimate heir, that would have made literary Sinitic even more of a Chosŏn thing, and it becomes much more of a pliable thing to kind of tweak around and play with. But at the same time, we are dealing with, Park Ji-won and Eok, they're also 19th century individuals, late 18th and early 19th individuals. So there has to be another kind of explanations. One explanation has been offered is, the Kongan writers, late Ming iconoclastic writers, which really influenced a lot of the primarily Seoul-based writers, all of these names that we mentioned. And yes, Jeongjo's stylistic restoration was quite aware of it, of course. But when you read his own letters, right, to Shim Hwan-ji, and when you see what he's doing is basically, again, interlacing his written text, using, yok, and sometimes using Hangul for literary effect, basically, right, to convey his anger or to capture his anger as efficacious as possible. Although it's not, sort of literary writing. He was, as far as literature was concerned, for Jeongjo, it was very much the Tangsong style, 고문. He was, he published a bunch of anthologies, he edited a bunch of texts. So it was very much sort of in conflict, although it was becoming more and more pervasive.
Okay, I think we are out of time, so I think we have to end. But I would encourage everybody to buy this book, her book, which was based on her presentation today. This is such an really exciting book that I was just in. This was a page turner. I just sat down and read, from the beginning until the end. I learned so much. And for those of you who've, well, first of all, thanks for submitting such great questions. And we'll be selecting one question, one attendee who asked a question, and we'll be in touch, and we'll be sending you the book copy. Thanks again for being with us. So next, our book talk series on Chosŏn will be on March 29th about the Diary of 1636 and the Manchu Invasion of Korea by Professor George Callender at Syracuse University. Hope you can join us again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.